Hello, this is Ron Rowell, the host of 45 Forward. You know, there's been a lot of buzz these days about longevity, with all the advances in health and wellness contributing to longer and longer human lifespans. But what does a longer lifespan really mean? The L word, lifespan, is touted a lot, but what we really need to focus on is our individual health span. How long can we effectively do the things we need to do and want to do that support a productive and meaningful life? And how do we know where we are on our lifespan, on our health span? And our lifespan and our health span, actually. What do we need to do? What activities and habits are worth investing in to take us where we want to go? These are important and often challenging questions, so I'm gratified today to have as my guest Scott Fulton, a renowned longevity expert. Scott is a health span and aging researcher, and he's an adjunct professor at 3 universities where he teaches about health span, senior housing, and aging. He's an author of several books, including most recently Function, Turn Your Blind Spots into Strengths, and WealthSpan. And what I especially appreciate about Scott is the way he can integrate practical longevity science and real-world experience that relates to all of us. So now let's meet my guest, Scott Fulton. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. It is always a pleasure to sit down and have a conversation with you.
I agree. We've had several conversations over the years, and every one is enlightening to me. I learn something new every time. And we've talked a lot about health span before, and now talking about function, I think, is an important kind of advancement for me. So, let me just ask you a little bit before we, because we have a PowerPoint that we put together that I think takes us through your book Function quite nicely. But tell me a little bit before that. How did you get onto this notion of function as opposed to just health span?
Yeah, it's a curious thing. There was no particular eureka moment. There were 1,000 moments of, I would say, dissatisfaction might be a way to put it. My background as an engineer and scientist is measure, measure, measure. If in doubt, measure again and triangulate. And it's just in my nature of like, I've learned measure as many things as you can and then figure out what's the data telling you and what's the data you can use. You can't use it all, and when I think about health, right, we measure lots of things in health, but I also kind of think about as an athlete when I'm training for a half marathon or something or a race, I've got a plan, I've got a pace, I've got a heart rate and things that does a really good job of predicting what my race day should look like, all else being equal. And I thought for all the things we measure around health, we don't do a very good job at all at measuring or predicting health span and it just has always kind of nagged at me. Why? Like, why is that? And so that was really, I think, got me searching because I'm a researcher, so I'm always looking for answers and asking questions in odd places. And it just, by accident, I think, landed into really looking at more maybe the disability, or we talk about the activities of daily living kind of towards later life. Like, what do those mean? Like, those are numbers and there's thresholds. Like, people ask me, getting into senior living, well, you have to make sure you get in while you're still active because they won't let you in if you're too late, right? Because those are the activities of daily living thresholds, which kind of, I think was one of the things as well that got me thinking, well, what do those numbers mean? People are measuring them, and it just got me heading down this path to realize there's a lot of data there for the healthy population that no one has really seen. And so when I saw it, I was like, this was not a book I planned to write. It wasn't a topic I planned to research. But once I found it, it was like, I can't not. This has to be shared.
Right. Yeah. So, I think that I'm gonna start the PowerPoint now to go right into some of your initial thoughts about just medical metrics versus functionality. So let me just start this and see if I get this right. Okay, let me start up here. All right. Okay, here we go, Scott. So now let's talk. We call it the Healthspan Playbook, and looking at the things, that you've talked about, the various metrics of lifestyle medicine, and how do these things relate to Healthspan?
Right. So there's a few ways to do it. This is, so I'm a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which is really kind of built on top of mainstream medicine, but really leveraging the lifestyle tools that we talk about. And you and I have talked about the MEDAC system, the mind, environment, diet, activity. These are all essentially the same theme or different ways of looking at it, which whatever resonates. But we certainly recognize within medicine today, there's a lot more we can and should be doing really around giving lifestyle guidance to people around what works. We see things that are recommended as part of disease management, more so than disease prevention. That's where a lot of us would like to see more effort in prevention. But regardless, there's still things around diet in terms of generally around whole foods, largely. Activity, I think everybody's heard that message, the importance of sleep, the importance of managing stress. Like we want certain types of stress in certain quantities, and we need recovery, which is where the sleep and stress go together. Avoiding risky substances or substance abuse, and then that positive connection. Those are really the ones we think about as the pillars of lifestyle medicine. And they're really foundational to what to do. But what none of them tell us is what's the outcome of that.
Right.
We measure outcome only on a disease, but if I asked you, how do you measure your health span, you're unlikely to tell me it's going to be based on a disease. It goes right back, we talked about those activities of daily living. How long can I do the things that I want to do, that I need to do? That's health span to me.
Right.
And so there's this bit of a disconnect between the way medicine operates and the way I think the public operates, which kind of gets to why some of the advice that's offered doesn't really resonate with people. This probably connects more for the people who view themselves as fit, and they infer function from that. And so if I think about my friends, my cycling friends or running friends or weight training friends, and as soon as we start to talk about what this idea of function is, they can't wait to jump in and interrupt. Yeah, I work out 5 times a week. It's just in their nature because they've had to defend what they're doing for so long, perhaps. But it really comes down to understanding function is much broader. It's like a portfolio or an investment portfolio. And you can be a great runner, a marathoner. You could be a great cyclist. You could be a great weightlifter. Choose any one of those categories, which are not the only ones, but popular, where people tend to get very focused on their one activity, and then look across the demographic of those who live well into their 90s and beyond. And interestingly, you don't tend to see those people in that demographic. They don't actually fare as well as they think, even though we hear data around, all these things are really healthy and VO2 and things. So it's really this kind of linear fitness versus functional fitness. Function is by nature the ability to do a lot of different things in different circumstances that navigate through the activities of life at all ages.
So, segueing right into that, you talk about various domains of function. So let's just, there are 5 different domains here. Let's talk about these domains.
Right. It's, we could break it into many, and that's really when I started the research. Was one of the things I figured out was, okay, I've got to partition these into some areas that make sense. And so one of them is, which is probably the most familiar to people, is strength and power. So strength is really the ability to do something once. Power is the ability to do it over a period of time in terms of applying strength over time. They're related. They're not exactly the same, but for the purposes of function, we can reasonably group them together. And then they go right into cardiovascular and recovery, because in order to have strength, or particularly to have power, you need some cardiovascular ability. And the recovery piece is how fast does your heart rate recover, or how fast does your body recover after it experiences some stress. The third one is mobility and balance. And that's, again, goes back to the ability to do all these things. And I'll use the example of the runner, maybe, who's very good at running a straight line, but don't ask me to go in multiple directions. It all starts to come undone, maybe. The gymnast suddenly looks a whole lot better in that scenario. Flexibility and structure is another one, again, where people get too linear. They tend to suffer in flexibility and structure. And structure is really, mainly we're talking about skeletal structure, which where you see people in later life, they start to get hunched over and limited mobility and range of movement. And then the fifth one is not fifth because it's the least important by any measure. It's neuromotor and cognition. When we think about function, a lot of us tend to think about physical, but really not much happens physical without some neuromotor activity behind it. And then the cognition is purely, we think about within the brain, your ability to receive information, process it, and then execute on whatever that information was, or maybe it's memory recall, for example. So it's really strength and power, cardiovascular and recovery, mobility and balance, flexibility and structure, and neuromotor and cognition. Essentially everything we talk about function will fit into those 5 foundations.
Right, and you talk about at the end in the slide you mentioned there's a high interdependence of all these 5 functions together, and so this image is indicative of what the limitations are if the functions don't work together, right?
Right, because if you break a cord, and that's where we see examples all the time where people who are good in one area but they're weak in another. And so one might be like cognition. Might be an example for people, and it's one that people tend to care about. So we see correlations with activity level and exercise with better cognition, both in the moment and in later life. But it's not a guarantee. We have to remember those are associations. There are things happening within the neuromotor system and cognition that exercise helps, but exercise itself does not guarantee strong neuromotor and cognition in later life.
Right, and this is a friend of yours, a golfer, but when we talked about this previously, so there are some things that some functions that work well, but not completely in his case.
Yeah. This is a story in my younger days when I had more time to golf. I'm supposed to have more time now, but that's just not the way it worked out.
Right.
I loved to golf. I was a member at a lovely golf club, and relatively small, perhaps by some standards, but a really nice history of the club. It was one of the oldest clubs in Canada. And one of the fellows there, I noticed he was a club champion a few years, and he was golf was his life. It was his identity, and he just had such a simple, consistent swing, and he just I understood that it wasn't that he was the longest hitter or the best at anything. He was just really consistent. What I also noticed was that he was complaining of back problems, and at a relatively young age of less than 50. He found himself in an ability to hit the ball long and straight, but lost the ability to bend over and put the ball on the tee and get it out of the hole. And it wasn't simply that he had back issues. It was really that he had not really taken care of his functional health along the journey. And it quickly meant the end of golf for him. So big identity challenge for him, and unfortunately, instead of seeing him out on the golf course, I ended up seeing him leaning up at the bar in the lounge, is where he spent most of his time, and that clearly didn't lead to the best outcomes. And so we tend to think about, again, these pockets of function. So even though he was able to drive the ball a long way, he didn't have the flexibility to bend over and put the ball on the tee, which is kind of step one in golf. And so we need to think about function in this multiple domain viewpoint where there's a few things we're trying to keep all moving along together.
Right. So one of the things that you talk about too, in terms of comparison to lifestyle medicine metrics, is that the functional domains actually are in some ways more interesting because they're highly predictive, whereas other kinds of medical metrics, diet and exercise, and those measurements may not predict your functionality. So this is an interesting graphic. So talk about this. Explain this a bit.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. So you can take from that there's a fair bit of data, and there is a lot of data behind this. The easiest way to talk about it for people, I think, is to talk about walking, because most of us are able to walk. And it's something that medically, it's one of the few things functionally we measure early in childhood, typically when a child takes their first steps at around age 1, and continue to walk faster as they get through their childhood and into their adolescence. And if they join the track team, the coach is clearly interested in how fast that walking can be turned into a run and 100-yard dash or whatever it might be. And then largely we forget about walking speed. And you talk about walking, most people say how many steps they did. That seems to be the popular term these days. But what this chart shows is that people walk at quite different speeds. And ultimately, though, what we see is it peaks in their early 20s, does a slow decay over the decades of adulthood. And then in later life, usually sometime around 70 or so, it starts to decelerate at a much quicker rate. And at some point, again, we go back to this activities of daily living, because if it gets too slow, then a lot of things start to come at risk. One being obviously falls are going to start to happen if you're moving slow enough. And so if you start to look at the data, what it says is that there's really two things. The faster I walk at any age, the higher I am in terms of it's a longer trajectory to get to those limitations that happen in later life. So the better I am at 40 or 50 or 60, the later I'm going to have to deal with those activities of daily living presenting an issue or health span limits. And then the other would be, I start at a higher value, but I also have a slower decline, which means I'm continuing to invest. That's what we see. I think a lot of people have picked up on walking. And so they're out walking, which is great. And they're trying to slow that decline down. The important thing about that is that walking speed is far more important than the number of steps.
Interesting.
So that's what this is talking about, gait speed. Lots of buzz about number of steps, and steps are good, but if you take twice as long to do 5,000 steps as someone who does it in obviously half the time, that should intuitively tell you something about your functional ability. And so there's way more data on gait speed or walking speed than there is on steps. So that's what really this gets at, is to understand what's the role of the gait speed. And then there's a number of other metrics that we can think about or look at. Seated reach, which is just essentially sitting on the floor. How close can you come to reaching your toes? There's a timed up and go as one of the standard tests. Up from a chair, you walk a few meters and come back and sit down. Chair stands are a great one. People, once they hear that, it's simply how many times can you stand up and sit down from a chair without using your hands in 30 seconds. And then that other one is trail making, which is essentially it's a cognitive exercise where you're doing some task switching in your brain and following it. Like, think about it like a paint by number, but just with pencil. So there are a number of things that we can look at with function and measure quite simply and reliably.
Yeah, interesting. So I just want to move on. So one of the things you talk about too is that we think we may be doing well in these areas, and we'll talk a bit more as we go along. But one of the things you emphasize is not just looking at our strengths, but our blind spots, which are in some ways more instrumental in determining where our functional strengths are. So let's talk about the concept of blind spots, weak links.
Right. And so maybe the story of the golfer is a good one to give an example of what a blind spot was for him. But I think for the audience, there's an element of really understanding that function isn't just one thing. Function is multiple things all working together. You can maybe it's like the car has four wheels. Lose one tire or lose one wheel, and suddenly your function suffers significantly. And that same concept really applies to the five functional domains I talked about. And again, you think about maybe the car example, the other three wheels could be brand new tires, everything's great, but for whatever reason you got some bad tire or weren't able to put it on. Clearly that's the weak link, and that will be the blind spot, and that's the one that's going to fail. And so that's really how I think we should be looking at our health in terms of from a functional wellness. What is my blind spot? Can I address that? Because that's the one that's going to bring us down. The other three tires aren't going to be a problem. Like you could have great strength or whatever it is. So it's really this figuring out where my blind spot is, because no one's told me how to measure it or when to measure it or what to do. And so ultimately that's really what we're trying to help people find.
So, in terms of improving our functionality, what are the kinds of activities and what are the nature of activities that really are most effective in terms of increasing both our health span and our lifespan?
Well, it ultimately comes down to a very individual choice in terms of what things we like to do, but also, again, going back to what are the things about our blind spots? What blind spot is it that we want to address? Not to harp on it too long, but the other comment to make about blind spot, I think, is what we forget is it brings our strengths down.
Right.
Versus if we can identify what our blind spot is, whatever that weakness is, it essentially, we won't just make that better, we'll make all the other ones better because they've always been, many are compensating along the way. So we want to allow them to flourish and at the same time get our weak link lifted up. And so what to do ultimately, and I wrote about it in the book with each one around what are some of the things to do to help people. Most of them I think are quite intuitive for people, which again is what they like about it. It's so obvious when you start to look at it differently than what we've been told all this time around different exercises that may or may not be of interest to me and may not even be what's appropriate. Like we hear all the direction, really need to do more strength training to address sarcopenia, osteoporosis, perhaps, but that may not be your weak link. Nothing wrong with doing it, but are you working on the right problem? So ultimately, we want to allow people some individual ways to understand what the need is, what the opportunity is, and then where to focus from there.
Right. Okay. Focusing a little bit more on blind spots and areas of weakness. You mentioned 5 top areas, which these are leading indicators of when your health span is compromised. Again, they're not just like heart rate or things like that. They're really sort of functional issues. So let's just run through these quickly. Yeah.
Right, and this really comes back to not necessarily that they're the best test. This criteria is based on what are the earliest indicators.
Right.
Right. That's a little bit different way of looking at it, because there's no point looking at something a few seconds before it happens if I can learn about it, like a traffic light that's going to change. That's why we have yellow in between green and red, right?
Right.
So it's this idea of how can I get some early indication? So generally, grip strength is recognized as the earliest indicator of essentially health span being at risk, not because grip strength in and of itself is critical. It's what it represents. You don't get good grip strength without doing a lot of activities in terms of moving your body, managing your body weight, lifting heavy things, which results in an outcome that just happens to show as high grip strength. it's a very sensitive measure, and it starts to fall away pretty quickly as soon as we stop doing those things. That's probably why it's one of the earliest indicators.
Interesting. Okay.
Yep. And the other one, right, that chart that we looked at a little bit
Yep.
earlier is gait speed, right? We know that across the whole lifespan. So yeah, I could equally argue gait speed is the earliest one because if at 20 you're already walking slow, if you don't do something about choosing to walk faster, I could have told you at age 20 what you were headed for. So the other one, again, I mentioned is chair stands. A 30-second chair stand is a great one for an early indicator. Static balance, how long can you stand on one leg without having to have support? That test ultimately, you can do it for 45 seconds at any age. That's generally where that test maxes out. It's it's somewhat simplistic, but again, a good indication of what's going on in terms of signaling inside the brain. And then the other one is a timed up and go. We see that more in a clinical environment. People can set it up and do it at home fairly easily if they understand what's involved. But point is, there are lots of ways that are we would call leading indicators to know where we are on a health span or if it's a risk.
Okay. So this was sort of an interesting metaphor or an image that you offered that I thought was pretty interesting. So explain these two hands then.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm always trying to find different ways to talk about these things. I'd be happy to look at charts all day, but I know that's not what other people want to see. So we think about, all the shiny things that were offered, and I thought, well, a deck of cards maybe is a good way. We're pursuing the ultimate sometimes instead of optimum. And so if we think about a deck of cards, or a playing game of poker, that hand on the left with jack through ace of all one suit, that's got a lot of potential. We're almost at a royal flush, right? So it's really tempting to want to hold that hand versus a full house of nines and tens beats ace high all day, all night, every day, all day, every year. Right? We all know that. But nines and tens, there's no face cards, no aces. That doesn't look that sexy or inviting. But it's another way of kind of thinking about that's what happens with a blind spot. People don't recognize, they don't see that, that five of diamonds in that hand is going to get you in a lot of trouble. You need to pay attention. You need to do something about it. You don't have to. You can throw away some of those top cards if you can get yourself a decent hand. You're going to have a good outcome. So that's kind of just a different way of kind of getting a mindset around what's a good, reliable hand. It's the one that's going to take you to the end and not leave you short. Like this point in life is not the time to be making big gambles. If you're a young adult, maybe this is the hand you want to play, but at this point, probably want to go for something a little more reliable.
Yeah, I agree. I'm at the reliability stage, definitely. So then, just sort of summing up, I thought this was a really good summary chart that we could basically, give a sense. It's not a deck of cards, but it does sort of outline, in a pretty straightforward, logical way. So let's just run through this.
Right, and so maybe I'll start with what were the criteria for tests to go into the book. So the first criteria was there had to be a lot of data to support it. And when I say a lot of data, drawing on 700,000 participants in multiple longitudinal studies over 50 years. So that group of primarily clinicians doing that work in lots of studies around the world have been supplying information into all sorts of tests that give really good indications over the lifespan for people. So there had to be a lot of data. So that meant anything new and sexy coming out of my smartwatch wasn't going to qualify. We wanted something reliable. We wanted it also to be in a way that people could progress through. Right? So I've talked about the 5 domains already: the strength and power, cardiovascular recovery, mobility, etc. I wanted to allow a progression where you could start with, well, what's tier 1? Let's start with some simple things like the chair stands, for example. it's pretty simple for people to figure that test out. It's not too complicated. Not that any of them are complicated, but what's a simple way to do where I can quickly get an assessment across all 5 domains, a couple of tests in each one to say, I seem to be really good here. I didn't think I was that good in whatever. Maybe it's mobility and balance. I never really practice it, but it just happens that I guess I'm better at it than I realized.
Mm-hmm.
And another one is weak. And so you may say, well, I don't believe it. I want more information,
Mm-hmm.
right,
Mm-hmm.
which is a natural objection people have. So naturally you go to tier 2 and start to get a little bit more data. So there's different tests that mainly are trying to fill in the gaps, because no
Mm-hmm.
one test gives all the information. No one test on any of these domains says, okay, I'm done. No, it's
Mm-hmm.
one test within one domain. You want to have multiple tests, essentially triangulate the information and say, if every test I do in strength and power, I'm like at 90 percentile, okay, pretty certain that's
Mm-hmm.
your strength,
Mm-hmm.
right? On the weakness one, you probably have some that are okay, and others like, oh, that was surprising. I thought it was better. So the idea was to get 3 tiers where people could work through, and then in that bottom right quadrant is the neuromotor and cognition
Mm-hmm.
tier 3, and that's ultimately where I try to lead people to, is where you're
Mm-hmm.
now starting to do what we call dual task testing or training, where we're doing a physical activity,
Right.
as simple as walking,
Right.
perhaps, and we're doing some math problems while we're walking, or some word problems, simple things where we're truly doing dual tasking. We've got a motor activity, and then we've got a cognitive load on top of it. And what we're trying to do is to work the brain in different ways, which is essentially causing neurogenesis. We're trying to stimulate new pathways in the brain, and that's really what the neuromotor and cognition and dual task training ultimately leads us to.
Mm-hmm.
But to get there, you need to have gone through some of the other basic tests, because if I gave you the ball toss, which is essentially just throwing the ball against a wall and catching it with alternating hands,
Mm-hmm.
that sounded easy when I was in elementary school. I
Mm-hmm.
discovered I hadn't done that in 50 or so years. That alone was a challenge. And now start to do some cognitive load, like simple things like, okay, let's do the alphabet backwards. And what we're looking at is what's the change in pace and our ability. And so that's why that information is really important to measure essentially our brain health or our signaling speed, and ultimately are the ways that we can now start to introduce new pathways, neuroplasticity, essentially reinforce our brain pathways as we age.
Yeah, this is a very good, straightforward way to measure ourselves as we move up the tiers. What would be the different activities we could test? So, yes, turning our blind spots into strengths. Very enlightening. So, I like especially that last chart. I'm gonna keep on my on my desk to sort of remind myself. So, well, thanks, Scott. So just in sort of summarizing, so what are some of the biggest myths you encounter about aging and fitness and about understanding functionality?
I think the most common myth might be is that people underestimate their ability. And that's true of all ages. There's nothing associated with aging necessarily here, but we've kind of fallen into this pattern of well, I couldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Or people don't expect me to do that, so I'm not going to embarrass myself by showing how bad I am at something. That really puts us on a path for troubles in terms of function, because we really want to be doing things that put us out of our comfort zone. Because what we do is, going back to what I talked earlier about these neural pathways and neuromotor systems, they are highly adaptable. You can learn to do any number of things at whatever age you're at. It may take you longer to get to a level where you feel competent, and competency may not be what you aspired to or thought it should be. That's not really the point. The point is you're now at a level where you can actually do it and participate, which usually also brings you into social settings that have benefits. And so It's just a common thing, and I'll put myself up there. For as much as I push myself in athletics, I still find I know I have more capacity that I don't tap into, and I'm balancing that with other things. But it really is the opportunity, and it's partly why I've spent so much time on trying to make this work of function available to people. So one of the things I just did recently was to open up function so people can go in and do some of these tests, these tier one tests on their own, see it all, get all the data, and it doesn't cost anything. If they're not ready to buy the book yet, that's okay.
Right.
Point is they'll get started, right? And that's really what this goal is, to help people get started and to see that they have a capacity and that they can improve at anything.
Right.
So the 30-second chair stand, great example, right? Go try it today. And you record your number that you did. Try it as you get up and down over the course of a week and 2 and 3 weeks. Test yourself every week or two. Pretty much guaranteed you're going to improve. It's the simple intention of bringing it to everyday activities. You don't have to go to the gym to improve chair stands. You can do it at home, just like virtually everything else we're talking about.
Yeah. And we've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth emphasizing that we've talked before about what's the one thing, that most important thing you could do. And I think that deals with your blind spots, right?
Yeah, that's what everyone asks. What's the one thing to do? Is find your blind spot. That's where you're going to get the bang for your buck.
Right.
You could be chasing the wrong thing. In all likelihood, you're chasing the wrong thing, because we tend to do the things that we like and we feel the best at.
Right.
We tend to push the other ones away.
Yeah.
Until something happens and we realize, yeah, I know I should have done that. Well, who wants to be that person?
Yeah. Yeah, sort of. And good to recognize your strengths, but overestimating them at the cost of your blind spots. As you pointed out before, if you have 3 good tires, but the fourth tire is no good, you're not going to have a very good ride.
Yeah, I'll use the example. I like multi-sports. I've done triathlon and Ironman things, and swimming is my nemesis.
Oh,
It doesn't matter. The more I train, the slower I go. It just, that's life, right? That's how it works sometimes. But I'll flip it around and say, but what I've learned is that I spot everybody a head start, and I spend the rest of the day on the bike and the run passing people. So psychologically, that's far better than being the first person out of the water and now trying to desperately hold on while people keep passing you because you're not very fast on the bike or the run. There's a silver lining to all of these things. So the fact that it's your weak link doesn't mean don't do it. It just means at least get proficient at it, so that it's hopefully not going to be your nemesis.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that happens to be mine too. I don't, I'm not a fast swimmer. I'm an okay swimmer. As I got through half a lap, I'm like, why are my legs sinking? Because I'm not really kicking. I'm just focusing on my strength is my upper body, and then that's my lower body is my blind spot. So
yeah, there's something about swimming that's, to me, you have it or you don't, and I can be fit enough to get my body pulling through the water, but it just, I stop and it just seems like I'm going down like an anchor.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Scott. This has been, once again, a really enlightening show. I just wanted to close with just telling people how they can find out more about you and about Function, and I assume they could get it on Amazon. They probably a number of ways they could get it and find out more.
Yeah, you can find, the book's available worldwide on Amazon. You can also go to wealthspan.com, so it's Healthspan with a W in front, and you'll see, if you go to Function, you'll see a link to go try some of the tests there.
Right, yeah. And I would encourage people, as I do, to follow Scott especially on LinkedIn, because you have lots of terrific essays there that I find myself reading through them and going, well, that's an interesting addition. And
it's a great community there. In the world of social media, LinkedIn shines for the group of people I have. I'm appreciative of everyone there.
Yeah, well, I just find myself getting many lessons from you, and like, oh, that's interesting. I thought think about that, and I'm very interested in aging and caregiving, and so these lessons are important in terms of, people think about caring for people as they get more infirm. And so it's like, yeah, well, why don't we care for them to keep them from getting to those stages, by, figuring out how to increase their health span so that, in the later stages of life, we're not dealing with these kinds of long-term care issues. So important lessons. I think one of the things that I learned from you is to think about it. You mentioned before you were an engineer, and to think about the reverse engineering process. So as we're 45 forward, what do we want to be when we're 75 forward? And thinking, what do we do now to make sure that our vision at 75 is what we want it to be?
Yeah, and it's there are no guarantees, but there's a lot of things that we can do to influence our outcomes.
Right.
But if we don't really have a vision of what that is, then we're really just kind of going through the motions, and you're going to get what you're going to get.
Right.
So why not put a little bit of planning into creating something you really would aspire to, and it makes a huge difference in your focus and mental perspective on how you approach aging.
Right. Once again, Scott Fulton, thank you very much, and until our next show.
Thanks, Ron. Great chat again.